Welcome to the deep dive. We've got some pretty strong opinions to look at today.
We certainly do.
Our source is an audio excerpt, and it's packed with commentary on the current political scene, really zeroing in on the Republican Party, President Trump, and frankly, a whole host of other players.
Yeah, and our goal in this deep dive really is to dissect the core arguments and, the underlying concerns in this audio.
Right.
We want to give you, the listener, a clear and objective understanding of the perspectives being shared and the very specific issues being raised here.
So kind of pulling apart these powerful opinions.
Exactly, to identify the concrete claims and, importantly, the connections the speaker is making. See how they build their case, so to speak.
Okay, so let's get right to it then. The central claim seems, well, pretty explosive, that the Republican Party is essentially fraudulent. The speaker we're looking at actually quotes Drudge, suggesting the GOP should be sued for fraud.
Yeah, that's a strong statement.
It really is. So what's fueling this pretty serious accusation?
Well, the speaker's reasoning, it kind of centers on what they see as a consistent pattern.
Yeah.
Unkept promises, basically, by the Republican Party.
Okay, like what specifically?
They really highlight the long-standing pledges, delivering tax cuts for the middle class and repealing the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare. Those are the key examples given.
Right, those were definitely major campaign points for a long time.
And it's interesting how often those specific promises come up and how, for this speaker at least, their non-fulfillment really resonates. It points to maybe a disconnect between the rhetoric and the practical side of governing.
And the speaker points to what they see as, well, a golden opportunity for the Republicans to have actually delivered on these things, right?
Precisely. Yeah, the speaker emphasizes that at the time this was recorded, the Republican Party held significant power. You had the presidency,
Right.
both houses on Congress, and the majority of governorships and state legislatures.
Oh, yeah.
The whole package, what people often call a trifecta.
So the argument is, with all that control.
With that unified control, yeah, the GOP should have had a clear path, theoretically, to enact their agenda. That's the setup.
Well, according to the speaker, that just didn't happen. So what's the core of the fraud accusation then? What makes it fraud in their view?
Well, the speaker interprets this lack of action on those key promises as deliberate stalling.
Ah, stalling, not just difficulty.
Not just legislative hurdles, in their view. It raises questions about the motivations behind inaction, even with a unified government. The implication is this wasn't just, procedural stuff.
Right.
It was maybe a calculated decision to delay fulfilling these core pledges.
Yeah.
Perhaps, the speaker suggests, until a point where their grip on Congress might be less secure.
The speaker really doesn't mince words when it comes to naming individuals either, do they?
No, definitely not.
There are a few prominent figures who come in for some very sharp criticism.
Yes, several figures within what they'd call the Republican establishment are specifically called out. Paul Ryan, for instance.
Right.
He receives particularly strong condemnation, portrayed as a key obstacle, really, to President Trump's agenda.
And others too.
Mitch McConnell and Reince Priebus are also mentioned in that same context, seen as, establishment figures hindering the president's objectives from within the party.
Okay, now here's where it takes maybe an interesting turn. The speaker introduces George Soros, suggesting a financial link to these individuals. Can you unpack that claim for us?
Yeah, so building on this frustration, the speaker adds another layer. They allege that George Soros previously funded the top 6 Republicans who opposed President Trump.
Okay, that's the first part of the claim.
Right, and then they extend it, asserting that Soros is now also providing financial support to Paul Ryan and others within that Republican establishment group.
I see.
So it's presented as this narrative of external influence working to undermine the president's agenda, even from within his own party.
Wow. It really sounds like the speaker is experiencing a significant level of disillusionment with the Republican Party itself.
Absolutely. You could really hear it. The audio conveys this palpable sense of frustration. It's about the perceived failure to deliver on those promises, yes, but also what they see as active resistance to President Trump's agenda.
A sense of betrayal, almost.
Yeah, I think that's a fair way to put it. There's a clear sense of betrayal being articulated.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit now to Matt Drudge. The speaker highlights some of Drudge's concerns, apparently expressed on Twitter. What were the main points Drudge was making, according to this source?
Well, Drudge's statement, as the speaker quotes it, is pretty blunt. GOP should be sued for fraud. Questions priorities and if party can lead. That really sums up a significant skepticism about the Republican Party's capacity and maybe even willingness to govern effectively at that time.
And the speaker we're analyzing, they go on to detail some specific issues that seem to be bothering Drudge in his tweets.
Yes, several specific policy areas seem to have triggered Drudge's criticism as relayed by our speaker.
Like what?
One was the reported consideration by the White House of an executive order targeting conflict minerals.
Conflict minerals, okay. How is that interpreted?
Well, Drudge, and our speaker echoes this, interpreted it as a potential move towards creating a monopoly, something that could negatively impact smaller businesses.
I see. What else?
Another key concern was the apparent ongoing existence of the Obamacare penalty tax.
Still, despite the promises.
Despite those repeated Republican promises to repeal the Affordable Care Act entirely, that was a big point of friction.
He also mentioned a lack of progress on tax cuts, didn't he?
Yes. Drudge apparently also noted the absence of significant discussion or, forward movement on tax cuts, another central piece of the Republican platform historically.
Right.
And furthermore, he criticized what he saw as a pattern, maybe, of Republicans focusing on opposing the opposition.
Rather than leading.
Exactly. Rather than demonstrating proactive leadership, citing their vote to shut down Senator Warren as an example of that dynamic.
So it's clear the speaker we're examining aligns with many of these frustrations voiced by Matt Drudge.
Very much so.
But their concerns seem to stretch even wider, right? Beyond just the Republican Party itself.
That's right. Yeah, the speaker identifies a much broader range of entities they believe are actively working against President Trump.
Such as?
This includes what they broadly label the establishment and globalists. Those terms often used for people or groups seen as prioritizing international interests over national ones, though the exact meaning can shift.
Okay, those are kind of general terms. Any specific?
They also list more specific entities. The corrupt Vatican, the communist Chinese, and Saudi Arabians are all named.
Wow, that's quite a list of opponents.
It is.
But despite this perceived widespread opposition, the speaker does offer a defense of President Trump, pointing to some of his initial actions in office. What were those?
Right. The speaker credits President Trump with taking some initial steps that, aligned with his campaign promises.
Yeah.
They specifically mention efforts to enhance border security, attempts to restrict entry from certain majority Muslim countries, what some call the travel ban.
Yeah.
Also, the initiation of regulatory rollbacks, which the speaker frames as a significant form of tax relief in itself.
An interesting framing.
And the move to withdraw the United States from the Paris Climate Agreement.
Okay, let's maybe delve a bit deeper into that point about the Paris climate deal. What's the speaker's specific perspective on that?
Well, the speaker characterizes the Paris deal as, and this is their phrasing, a carbon tax only on the West, not on China and India.
So, unfair burden.
That's the argument, that it unfairly burdens American industry, all under the premise of addressing man-made global warming.
And they dispute that premise.
They do. They dismiss it as a proven fraud, citing alleged disclosures of internal emails as evidence for that claim.
Okay. These are certainly some wide-ranging concerns. The speaker then shifts focus again towards potential domestic unrest and external forces fueling it.
Yes, this part of the audio takes us maybe a slightly different direction. The speaker refers to a Max Lavo article, apparently published on Infowars.com.
Okay, and what did that article supposedly say?
It reportedly discussed the U.S. Army's preparations for urban warfare in major cities.
Urban warfare, why?
Citing factors like mass migration, potential natural disasters, and inner-city turmoil as reasons for these alleged preparations.
And how does the speaker connect this to the idea of external influences?
Well, the speaker claims that George Soros has significantly increased funding for Black Lives Matter and other similar groups.
With what alleged intention?
With the alleged intention of stirring up unrest. That's the direct quote used.
Okay.
And they argue that this orchestrated unrest is contributing to calls for civil war, and that the supposed military preparations mentioned in that article are actually a response to this manufactured internal threat.
So a very specific chain of cause and effect being laid out there.
Yes, very specific.
The speaker's analysis doesn't stop there either, does it? They also bring in some major players from the financial world.
That's correct. Yeah, the speaker accuses prominent financial institutions, Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, and Bloomberg are named,
Right.
of actively trying to depress the stock market and, quote, kill this recovery.
So deliberately harming the economy.
That's the implication, that these powerful financial entities are undermining the economy for their own undisclosed purposes.
It sounds like the speaker is aware that maybe some of their past predictions haven't quite panned out, and they seem to address media criticism on this point.
Yes, they do touch on that. The speaker dismisses media criticism about previous predictions, specifically mentioning military actions and the supposed Planet X.
Planet X.
Yeah.
Okay, how do they explain those?
They argue that their earlier statements about military preparations were just, quote, conditioning for down the road. And they downplay the significance of past missed timelines, especially regarding Planet X, which they claim to have consistently labeled as BS anyway.
Okay. Throughout all this commentary, the speaker makes their own motivations and allegiances pretty clear, wouldn't you say? What's their stated stance?
They're quite explicit about it. The speaker states their work is on behalf of you, the listener, as well as for their own interests, prosperity, and decency.
Okay.
And they express support for fundamental principles, freedom, justice, free markets, free association. It's important to notice how that kind of direct appeal works, aims to build trust and legitimacy with the audience.
And they also signal plans to keep reporting on these kinds of issues.
Yes, the speaker pledges to continue providing updates on preparations for what they foresee as potential civil unrest and societal collapse.
Strong language there.
Very. They also use strong rhetoric, labeling opponents as agents of evil and commending President Trump for his efforts in defending against radical Islamists.
Okay. And finally, the speaker just touches on the issue of censorship and alleged problems with podcast platforms.
That's right. Just briefly at the end, they mention upcoming discussions about censorship and alleged difficulties with how their content is being treated on platforms like Google Play and iTunes. They even reference a conversation with Joe Rogan, suggesting a broader pattern of censorship impacting their reach.
Okay, so let's try and bring it all together then. What are the key arguments being presented in this audio excerpt that we've just explored?
Well, I think the central arguments really revolve around that strong accusation of fraud against the Republican Party.
Right, the failure to deliver.
Exactly. For their perceived failure on key promises, despite holding significant political power. But it's intertwined with these broader anxieties, about the influence of globalist forces and other entities seen as opposing President Trump.
And the domestic unrest angle.
And then there are the concerns about potential domestic unrest, which the speaker believes is being deliberately instigated by external actors like Soros. Plus, those alleged attempts by financial institutions to sabotage the economic recovery. It's a complex web of accusations.
So, for you, the listener, what would you say are the most significant takeaways after this deep dive into the speaker's commentary?
Well, several things stand out, I think. First, just the sheer intensity of the speaker's conviction and the directness of the allegations made against prominent political figures and institutions, it's quite striking.
And the connections they draw.
Yes. Secondly, the way the speaker connects that perceived betrayal by the Republican Party to much wider societal issues, potential civil unrest, economic manipulation, it reveals a particular worldview where all these events are seen as interconnected, driven by specific actors with discernible agendas.
Okay. Finally, as you reflect on everything we've discussed today, what's a provocative thought perhaps to leave you with?
Maybe consider the fundamental role of accountability when it comes to political promises. What are the potential ramifications for public trust, for the broader political landscape, when a significant voice within a political sphere accuses a major party of fraud based on perceived inaction or deception?
Interesting question.
Yeah, how might that kind of rhetoric shape our understanding of governance and, the relationship between elected officials and the people they're supposed to represent? Something to think about.